Hello there once again. Greetings to our Pilgrim Church family, as well as to any visitor who has tuned in for today's daily online spiritual encouragement or D.O.S.E study. This is Danny here once again on behalf of all the elders at the Pilgrim Church of Christ with our study for Tuesday, February the 22nd, 2022, which coincidentally is 22222. We're continuing with our most recent study series, and at this point, we've completed 4 of the expected 12 weeks of study, or 1/3 of the total. Our lessons are taken from this book, which we at the Pilgrim Church of Christ used as the basis of a small group program back in 2008. The book was published by Serendipity House of Littleton, Colorado, and it uses Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as a basis for its study on the topic examining your life. Unfortunately, should you wish to do further study on your own, this particular book was actually published back in 1998 and it now appears to be out of print. But there are, however, several other books available regarding the Sermon on the Mount from this publisher or various other publishers, which you can obtain either online or in person at your local bookstore. Now, our reference text says this in its introduction, quote, "The Sermon on the Mount is a picture of what the inner character of the follower of Jesus in any age should be like," end quote. The text also divides Jesus's full 3-chapter sermon into a brief outline that consists of 3 very broad sections. Notice how each section emphasizes one's character, as the introduction statement we just quoted has pointed out. Section 1 is entitled The Character of the Disciple, and that comes from Matthew 5, verses 1 through 20. Section 2 is entitled Examples of this Character, and references Matthew 5, 21 through 7, 6. And then Section 3 has admonitions to pursue this character. This comes from Matthew 7, verses 7 through 27. Now, with our first 3 weeks of study, we covered Section 1. And then last week, we had our first study from Section 2. And we'll continue to be in that section for each week's video into the middle of week number 11. And within this longer period, we'll continue to find Jesus presenting examples of appropriate character traits that should be evident within the lives of his disciples. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount, as it appears in the most well-known translations, has no doubt been read, been studied, and been heard many times by each of us. As a result, these passages are quite familiar to us. So with that in mind, I've decided to take each week's scripture readings from some alternate translations, ones that will read and sound somewhat differently from what our ears have become accustomed to hearing over the years. In doing this, my hope is that it will not only help us maintain our attention on the message of the scriptures quoted, but will also encourage within each of us a desire toward pursuing a deeper personal study. As with the previous lessons, I offer the following suggestions. Before we go any further with today's study, pause the video, read the text of Matthew 5, 27 through 37 from the translation with which you are most accustomed and that you prefer to use for your personal time of reading and studying. And then when you've completed that, return to today's video. Here then is the reference passage for today's study. Matthew 5, 27 through 37, and I have chosen the Amplified Bible version. Again, the words of Jesus. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who so much as looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble and leads you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. That is, remove yourself from the source of temptation. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble and leads you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. That is, remove yourself from the source of temptation. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." It has also been said, whoever divorces his wife is to give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who has been divorced commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord as a religious duty. But I say to you, do not make an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you are not able to make a single hair black or white. But let your statement be yes, yes, no, no, a firm yes or no. Anything more than that comes from the evil one. Now, in our previous videos, we've seen Jesus presenting the following to his disciples. First, he presented the Beatitudes, 8 admirable character traits which were to be pursued by those who were following him. Secondly, he presented the very real possibility of persecution for those same followers. Thirdly, he presented the warning that a disciple's righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. And fourth, he presented an explanation that true obedience to God's law, specifically in last week's case, the command, do not commit murder, calls for one's inner attitudes to be held in check to prevent the development and execution of the outer actions condemned by such laws. Today we find Jesus continuing to expound more on that last topic by repeating 3 more restrictions placed upon God's people, and then once again proceeding to dissect and explain God's initial intention for each. Last week we pointed out that Jesus employed the following pattern. You have heard, but now I tell you. We've speculated that the phrase, you have heard, would suggest that Jesus was focusing strictly upon the words of the law themselves. However, by continuing with the contrasting phrase, but now I tell you, we were led to conclude he was speaking to how, either through misguided teachings on the part of some religious leaders, or perhaps through misguided understanding on the part of some students of God's Word, one can as a result miss out on the nature of God's true intentions. Excuse me. Now let's see what thoughts of interest we can extract from today's reading. The portion of law that Jesus examined in today's study is the command, quote, you shall not commit adultery, end quote. As was the case last week, this commandment, the 7th in the list of the original 10, speaks to the physical action that results in what we understand to be having sexual relationships with another person's spouse. We should note at this point that the fact that Old Testament law also prohibited the following perversions of natural sexual relations. It prohibited fornication, it prohibited incest, it prohibited bestiality, it prohibited homosexuality, and it prohibited rape. One could easily interpret God's prohibition of adultery as laid out specifically in the commandment as the foundation for an implied prohibition within the same commandment of any of these other perverse approaches to human sexual expression. Jesus once again proceeds to expound on the law's words, speaking here to the danger of inner attitudes that give rise to the external act of illicit sex itself. Jesus continues the pattern from last week's study. Just as he had warned that anger often precedes and fosters murder, he now states that, quote, everyone who so much as looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart, end quote. The severity of deliberately harboring the desire for an illicit relationship is underscored by Jesus' next statements. First, he says, if your right eye makes you stumble and leads you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. Then he says, if your right hand makes you stumble and leads you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Wow, those are certainly some intense demands coming from the tongue of Jesus, aren't they? That's why I chose to use the passage as it appears in the Amplified Bible, because it helps me better understand Jesus' instructions. It includes, with both statements, the explanatory phrase, quote, that is, remove yourself from the source of temptation, end quote. To me, these statements by Jesus present his intention that we should grasp the severity of God's law against adultery. Now, while it's true that the least intrusive and thus our most preferred response would be simply to remove ourselves from whatever situation, whatever location might produce a temptation by which we could succumb and fall, Jesus' words nevertheless confirm that should all else fail, we should take whatever measures, even should they at times be radical ones, that would serve to prevent us from sinning. Now, here are some word study notes of interest from this passage. Woman, in the original Greek usage of the word used here, most often referred to a married female. With lust, a term used to qualify how a man might look upon a woman, requires one to understand that Jesus is not condemning nor prohibiting natural sexual attraction, provided it is couched within Godly sanctioned, and godly accepted relationships. Jesus would instead probably have us learn from the words that were to be penned later by James in his New Testament epistle. Here's what we read in James 1, verses 14 and 15 from the original King James Version. James says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death." The word eye and the word hand encompass the two senses by which lust is typically generated, by sight and by touch, respectively. Jesus emphasizes that erecting a barrier to prevent runaway passion falls squarely upon the possessor of said eyes and hands, and not upon the recipient of the sight or touch. In the final portion of today's reference passage, Jesus continues with a discussion of divorce. First century Judaism would allow divorce on the basis of God's instructions in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, part of which Jesus quotes here. Quote, "Whoever divorces his wife is to give her a certificate of divorce," end quote. A couple of thoughts to extract from this Old Testament reference. One, the right to divorce and the right of the wife to remarry is assumed. Secondly, the intent of this command, which with its call for a certificate to be issued, was to protect a woman from being capriciously discarded by her husband without a justifiable cause. Providing for such a certificate would serve two purposes. One, it would verify her legal release from the first marriage, and secondly, it would provide for her a valid remarriage rights without the threat of being accused of adultery. Now, Jesus seeks with his words to counteract the potential mistreatment of a wife, exemplified by her husband heartlessly discarding her. He does not deny the validity of a certificate being issued. He does, however, warn that its usage is contingent upon there being a valid reason for dismissing the wife. He warns that if a husband callously sends away his wife, and if she should then marry another, then the original husband actually causes her to commit adultery. He concedes that there is one and only one situation that would remove this burden of guilt from the husband. In his words, quote, "except on grounds of sexual immorality on the part of the wife," end quote. Under this scenario, she would already be participating in an adulterous relationship, and as such, the husband then would not be in the place to cause her to enter into one. It should be noted that in the original Greek language used within this phrase includes a reference to every kind of unlawful sexual intercourse, as we mentioned earlier in our study. Again, with this passage, we observe Jesus going beyond the purely physical considerations and expanding into the spiritual aspects. The law required a certificate of divorce to prevent the expelled wife from having to endure public ridicule and public contempt. Jesus warned that unless the wife's unfaithfulness called for it, the husband who sent away his wife could jeopardize her spiritual standing with God by unwittingly driving her into an adulterous situation. Finally, Jesus addresses an issue that entails the general theme of several Old Testament passages and not necessarily one single command. He speaks to the idea of taking oaths or vows. He acknowledges that, quote, it was said to the men of old, you shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord as a religious duty. Now, while he does not negate the value behind such warnings, the Ten Commandments, after all, did specifically forbid lying, Jesus yet again goes further by questioning the value of introducing vows or oaths into the scenario in the first place. Jesus encourages his disciples, then and now, to shy away from incorporating them into our relationships with others. He defends this stand with two unarguable points. First, he suggests that there is nothing by which one might swear that is inherently a possession that mankind might invoke. Not by heaven, for it is the throne of God, he says. Not by earth, for it is the footstool of God's feet. Not by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Not by your head, for you are not able to make a single hair black or white. Secondly, he encourages every disciple to possess the type of character and reputation that would make one's word alone be sufficient to ensure compliance. In Jesus' words, he said we should simply let our statements be yes, yes, no, no. In other words, a firm yes or a firm no. And then he ends this portion of his message with this stern warning. Quote, anything more than that comes from the evil one. End quote. Well, I hope that these studies continue to be interesting to you and that they somehow manage to bless your life in some manner. May all of us continually strive toward the development of a deeper appreciation for and the quest for a greater understanding of God's eternal word. As each week passes, the number of various video offerings being posted and archived by our church family continues to grow and will thus continue to be available for you to access and to view online. COVID and its developing variants continue their relentless attacks on the health of our society collectively and on our health individually. Because of that, many of us are quite understandably hesitant to resume being comfortable interacting personally in close quarters to the extent that we once did, and perhaps we would like to do at some point again. So under these circumstances, the fact that so many recorded options are available for your access can be a great help toward our keeping in touch with one another, even if for the present time it should only be because of by way of technology. So if you should wish to access any of our church family's videos in their archived form, you can always retrieve them at a time convenient to you from our online resources. They're stored in different sites and in different formats. There is the Pilgrim Church of Christ page in Facebook. There's the Pilgrim Church media page in YouTube. And then there's our Pilgrim Church of Christ app that's available for your smartphone. I would urge each of you to either start or to continue setting aside an appropriate portion of each day to spend time reading and studying God's Word, and so letting Him speak to you from those words, as well as going to Him in prayer. I can confidently assure our Pilgrim Church family that as your shepherds become aware of any particular needs on the part of our members, we collectively and individually keep you in our daily prayers. We've just recently been able to resume our plans to visit the homes of various families during the week for the purpose of discussing and praying with you over any issues or concerns that you might have. Our wish is that when you are contacted for such a visit, you would graciously allow us to serve you in this way. And now, as we close out today's study, I'd like to present our reference text from one more translation. Now, this translation is admittedly one of the looser ones available, and it's one that the translators themselves designed for a middle school level readers, and with their intent being to produce a translation that can more easily be read aloud and thus listened to as it's read aloud. So here we have Matthew 5, verses 27 through 37, as it appears in the Voice translation. Again, the words of Jesus. As you know, long ago, God forbade his people to commit adultery. You might think you've abided by this commandment. Walk the straight and narrow. But I tell you this, any man who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. If your right eye leads you into sin, gouge it out and throw it in the garbage. For better you lose one part of your body than march your entire body through the gates of sin and into hell. And if your right hand leads you into sin, cut it off and throw it away. For better you lose one part of your body than march your entire body through the gates of sin and into hell. And here's something else. You've read in Deuteronomy that anyone who divorces his wife must do so fairly. He must give her the requisite certificate of divorce and send her on her way, free and unfettered. But I tell you this, unless your wife cheats on you, you must not divorce her, period. Nor are you to marry someone who has been married and divorced, for a divorced person who remarries commits adultery. You know that God expects us to abide by the oaths we swear and the promises we make. But I tell you this, do not ever swear an oath. What is an oath? You cannot say, I swear by heaven, for heaven is not yours to swear by. It is God's throne. And you cannot say, I swear by this good earth, for the earth is not yours to swear by. It is God's footstool. And you cannot say, I swear by the holy city Jerusalem, for it is not yours to swear by. It is the city of God, the capital of the King of Kings. You cannot even say that you swear by your own head, for God has dominion over your hands, your lips, and your head. It is he who determines if your hair be straight or curly, white or black. It is he who rules over even this small scrap of creation. You need not swear an oath. Any impulse to do so is evil. Simply let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Now, with our next study, we'll look at how Jesus continues expanding our understanding of the commandments and the laws that he discusses, always with the emphasis on the nature of a disciple's character. So until then, I pray that God blesses you and your families with good health and safety, and that this new year might continue to be one in which your blessings far outnumber your defeats. Should any members of our local church family feel the need to request a meeting with the elders, you can be sure that we have pledged to always be available at any hour, on any day, during any night even, to spend time in prayer with you and to spend time in prayer for you. For us, it would be both a pleasure and an honor to be asked to do so. So till next week, take care, everyone, and remember, I love you all. Goodbye.